to Beijing, there was shock and sympathy from the Vatican to the Kremlin. Russian President Putin called for a coordinated effort against terrorism. So did British Prime Minister Tony Blair.
We therefore here in Britain stand shoulder to shoulder with our American friends in this hour of tragedy. And we, like them, will not rest until this evil is driven from our world.
More than not just resting, in Britain they were rattled. Offices closing early in London's financial centre, commercial air traffic over the capital banned, as airlines here and throughout Europe cancelled transatlantic flights.
I'm certain in the short term we're going to face a much more restricted world, a world which is much more security conscious, much more anxious and much more fearful.
With European TV broadcasting live and non-stop, European governments called emergency meetings. So did NATO. Another echo of the attack in America were the questions asked here. Who was behind it and what happens now? The Taliban regime's ambassador to Pakistan today was part of the chorus calling for justice. He also insisted Osama bin Laden wasn't behind it. Bin Laden's not in contact with anyone, the ambassador insisted, and couldn't carry out such activity. It would be a great risk, he warned, for America to retaliate before completing an investigation. While Britain's calling mass terrorism a new evil the world needs to fight, some Europeans are more blunt. Germany calls the attack a declaration of war against the civilized world. But what all the allies are saying tonight is that America's not in this fight alone. Richard Roth, CBS News, London.
As we await President Bush's address to the nation and the world, which will be coming up in about 23 minutes now on the half-hour mark, joining us here in New York again is Andy Berger, who served as National Security Advisor to President Bill Clinton, and in our CBS News Washington Bureau, Democratic Senator Christopher Dodd of Connecticut. Thank you both for being with us. First, Senator Dodd, there's been an awful lot of talk today about the United States. We will find who's responsible for this and we will punish them. Why is anybody who hates the United States, why would they believe this when in the past we have proven time and again we can't find out who does the people who do these things, and we've been unable to punish them, really?
Well, first of all, Dan, let me step back for a second and tell you my thoughts, and I'm sure the thoughts of Sandy. I just left about 500 members of Congress on the east front of the Capitol where the leadership, Republicans and Democrats, joined together in expression of solidarity and sympathy for the literally hundreds of people, and I expect thousands who may have lost their lives today. We don't know the numbers yet, as you've reported accurately here, but it's hard to begin any discussion of this without talking about these families and what our country has gone through. And today, you used the language at the outset of your news tonight, using Franklin Delano Roosevelt's language almost 60 years ago, 12 weeks from now, calling this a day of infamy, and it truly is. So I wanted to begin there, and Tom Daschle and Trent Lott are going to have tomorrow a session on resolutions and an opportunity for us to be heard. Congress will be in session tomorrow. Democracy will always triumph over terrorism. And I hope here that we'll first of all concentrate on the tragedy here at home, do what's been suggested by some of your earlier guests, and find out exactly who is responsible here. And I'm confident we can do that. And go a step further here, and I'll be interested in what Sandy has to say about this, but I think a new chapter's been turned here. Too often we have sort of accepted other nations' notion that they would harbor these people, occasionally provide some financing, even training for them, and that they sort of had to do that for their own domestic security. I think those days are over with. I think any nation that supports, harbors, trains these individuals, whether it's Osama bin Laden or others who are responsible for it, there needs to be a collective response. You heard today President Putin. I think the Chinese made similar statements. This is a chance for the civilized world now, if nothing else comes out of this, to respond in the most aggressive and thorough way we can. This cancer is hitting all of us, and we need to respond to it accordingly.
Now, back to the original question, Senator. Are we capable of determining who did these things? And then are we capable of, in some way, finding them, bringing them to justice, punishing them?
I believe so. I think, first of all, this was a highly coordinated, very sophisticated attack here today. And I'm quite confident that the collective intelligence efforts of our allies, friends who have expressed support for us today, that we'll be able to determine that. We may not do it as quickly as some would like, and my hope would be that we'll do it smartly. It's very important that we know what we're talking about before we respond. But I'm very confident we can do it, and I think we have the means of doing it. It may not be as fast as some would like, but I believe it can be done.
Sandy Berger, Where are those voices in the world of Islam? Islam being one of the world's great religions. Where are those voices? Are there any, in any place that counts, who say, listen, we've had enough of this, and we will help the United States find and bring to justice these people?
Well, I think we have to be careful, Dan, that we don't condemn the world of Islam here. Obviously, there are 1 billion people who practice Islam around the world. This is perpetrated by a group, and we need to deal aggressively with the group. But I agree with Chris. We need the cooperation and concerted effort of all of our allies and friends, whether they are in Europe, whether they're in the Arab world or elsewhere, because we are now in a new phase of this war against terrorism. This is a watershed event, and we're not going to deal with this in one fell swoop. This is going to require a sustained, serious operation. And I think it's time for the American people to support the President, buckle our seatbelts, because this is going to be a long, hard ride.
True or untrue that in the past when there have been terrorist acts, nothing on this scale has happened, but there have been terrorist acts, many of our friends and, yes, allies.
So there's a record there. We know that he has...
As well, on this day, we're...
People has...
Dan, it was indeed a chilling moment when you made a reference there to United Flight 93 asking for a change of flight plan, headed for San Francisco, asking for takes it to Washington.
From the FBI. Locked himself in the bathroom of that and called 911 at 9:58 a.m., got in touch with a local 911 operator in this part of Pennsylvania, southwestern Pennsylvania, and told him there had been some sort of explosion on the plane. Shortly after that, 2 minutes later, in fact, the plane did go down. That report is not confirmed in total in some. However, the FBI says it has received tapes of a 911 call, and it is going to go over those tapes.
Just help us place Stoystown, Pennsylvania, a little more, with a little greater familiarity to people. You're fairly close to Johnstown?
We are fairly close to Johnstown. Stoystown is about 75 miles southeast of Pittsburgh and about... There were some eyewitnesses. We've heard that they saw the plane going down unstable before it went down, as you might imagine. People who live nearby say they heard the ground, they felt the ground shake miles away. People who went to the scene, we spoke to one eyewitness a short time ago, said she saw lots of debris, but nothing very big. And in fact, that's what our pictures are bearing out, that the debris is very, very small. This made a very hard landing, Peter.
Thanks very much, Dan Harris, in Stoystown, Pennsylvania tonight on the United Airlines flight, which started off from Newark to San Francisco, took off about 8:01. You see where it all converges? The first attack on the trade tower is just before 9 o'clock. The second one is after that, that an aircraft goes down at, sometime 8:35, between 8:30, maybe a little after 9 o'clock. And so the coordination involved in this has intelligence and military officials tonight confused, shocked, and steamed. Barbara Starr, one of our reporters of the Pentagon, reports tonight, quoting a senior intelligence official, our top priority tonight is nailing the SOBs who did this. And they are, Barbara reports us, tweaking every single intelligence system they have, their reconnaissance, their assets. And then they're going to go through, as we've heard earlier today, through all of the cable traffic. They're going to look to listen to all of the monitoring which the National Security Agency does of thousands of phone calls. And again, though this may not lead to anything, just a short while ago, Senator Orrin Hatch of Utah, who's a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, told the Associated Press that U.S. intelligence intercepted communications between supporters of Osama bin Laden discussing the attacks on the World Trade Center. And he then goes on to say, I'm just going to get his quote accurately here, they have an intercept of some information that included people associated with bin Laden who acknowledged a couple of targets were hit. I'm not sure how much that tells us at this point. They may simply having been reacting. If this report is true, they may simply have been reacting, as many people all over the world did immediately, to the fact that these attacks had actually occurred. It's not going to be very long from now before the president. I'm missing anything, John, before I go back to Washington and talk politics?
No, we're up to date.
Okay. John McCarthy, outside the Pentagon, unusually removed from your post, which I know must be very frustrating at this point, John. Want to add to Barbara Starr's reporting in terms of attitude on behalf of the military at the moment?
Well, attitude and what you describe as the intelligence community is now doing is a major wash. They are going after every agent they have all over the globe. They are focusing every piece of technology they have. They are desperately looking for answers to who did it, so they can then better go after who did it with what undoubtedly I now believe is going to be a series of military strikes. But you cannot do that until you have a very focused piece of intelligence that leads you directly to the culprits. And then there is, of course, the problem, once you decide you are going to use military force, of trying to decide how to make it in any way effective. It does feel good oftentimes to retaliate against accused people that you believe have done a terrible act like this to the United States, but it doesn't necessarily go after them and often creates additional problems, especially if it is proved that the terrorists who did this came from a region near the Middle East, like Afghanistan. That is going to set off a whole series of very complex political machinations, Peter, that could end up coming back on the United States.
But let me ask you an operational question, John. We believe at the moment that the United States had no inkling of what was going to happen, but there's a history of terrorism in various other parts of the world, to which the United States has been party victimized by in one way or the other. After an incident has occurred, is there any history of a tendency of people who perpetrated the terrorism to talk?
There is a history to claim credit in some way. Although I must say, Osama bin Laden, if he turns out to be the culprit who is behind this, has been often circumspect in the days and months after an attack. Intelligence sources have indicated in previous attacks that his organization was involved, but they had to piece that information together because he was, at least in the initial period after the attack, absolutely silent.
Thank you very much, John McCarthy. We have a microphone open somewhere else, and I think just trying to pick up the sound, that it is in our Washington position across from the White House. It's appropriate because we want to go there now, where Claire Shipman has been for most of the day. And Claire, the president, I think, is going, you tell us clearly, the president's going to talk to us, I think, fairly quickly now, pretty soon now?
That's right. He's going to talk to us, we're told, in just over 10 minutes, Peter. And I think what you've been talking about tonight, a lot
Claire,
of
let
anger...
me stop. Can I stop you? Maybe you'd move your microphone up. I'm sorry. There's a microphone, I believe, in your little location there, which is interfering with what you are trying to say. So do you want to try again?
All right. Is this any better?
It's somewhat better, yeah.
Good. Okay. Rough conditions here. But you've been talking about a lot of the anger being expressed in Washington tonight from military officials and others, and I think that is the sort of thing we're going to hear from the president tonight. We've been told he is quite angry. He's eager to talk about it. We're told his speech is going to be a mix of condolence, anger, and also retaliation, that he wants to make it very plain just how quickly he intends to act when he feels the United States is able to act. He and his aides still putting finishing touches on this speech. Probably hard to exaggerate the enormous importance of this speech for him tonight, Peter. A couple of other notes. Condoleezza Rice is at the White House with him as National Security Advisor. Colin Powell arrived recently back in Washington at Andrews Air Force Base, and we're told might be heading to the White House, but that depends on some security issues. The president was to meet with Vice President Cheney once he arrived back at the White House, and then we were told from security forces that he was going to have to leave the White House. They didn't want to keep the president and the vice president for very long in the same location, and he would either be heading home or to Camp David. Peter.
Thanks very much, Claire. We're going to come back to you very shortly because the president is going to talk. And in fact, Colin Powell just came back from Colombia today, where he has been, he's been visiting with leaders of Latin America about, among other things, the war against the international drug community. which is based very largely in Colombia, and there is no reason that any part of the world tonight should be, whatever our instincts are, whatever the history is, there's no reason tonight to rule out criminals from any part of the world who have the money, if not always the sophistication. That's a big, big question in terms of trying to resolve today, to have mounted this attack against the United States, though, as always, the intelligence community has gone almost immediately to Osama bin Laden as a principal suspect. And we don't yet know why they have done that, but it seems to be something of a tradition. It was great to see. It was really great to see the members of Congress gather and sing "God Bless America," and to tell the country and the world that the country's hanging together. But there was a time earlier today when the capital city was just closing down as absolutely fast as they could get it closed down. Take a look at this report from ABC's Michelle Norris.
With the Pentagon burning in the distance, the nation's capital was evacuated.
This is the first time we had a mandatory evacuation of the Capitol and the House and Senate office buildings.
Bewildered employees got out as fast as they could, while key congressional leaders were carefully whisked away to safe and undisclosed locations. Top leaders from throughout the administration were immediately placed under special protection.
The leaders are in undisclosed locations for their own safety and to ensure that we can reconstitute decision-making when that's appropriate.
The United States Secret Service immediately secured the President, the Vice President, and the Speaker of the House, and they are all safe.
It's all part of official Washington's civil defense plan to ensure that the federal government continues to function smoothly even while the nation is under attack.
And they basically have a playbook initially to assess how serious is this threat. Do we need to have a lot of people move very far away from Washington, or do we just need to have a few key backup people get outside of the immediate downtown area?
During the Cold War, the federal government developed an elaborate evacuation plan to make sure top leaders would survive a nuclear attack by taking them to a series of secret bunkers just outside Washington. Today, that wasn't necessary, but nonetheless, the nation's top decision makers remain under very heavy protection.
Making sure that the federal government continues to function, I think, is very important in a time of crisis because it reassures the public that somebody is in charge and the situation is well in hand.
And in today's time of crisis, Americans, as well as many elsewhere in the world, will be looking for that reassurance. Michelle Norris, ABC News, Washington.
Information is pouring into our newsroom from everywhere, trying to understand this. Here's a message from a friend who happens to be an architectural engineer who knows something about the World Trade Center and who believes that a member of the family may have been killed in the Trade Center at all. It's been impossible we've only had one person, at least on this broadcast, identified all day, and that is the wife of the Solicitor General of the United States, who managed to call her husband from the aircraft that was hijacked and then subsequently attacked the Pentagon. But he, an engineer and an architect, speculates here that the heat above the crash site on the Twin Trade Towers may have indeed caused the building above to melt, just simply collapsing in itself and putting enormous weight on the rest of the building below, which could not possibly stand it. And the steel columns which go up through the building, built to code at best, would only be able, he believes, to have been able to stand an hour and a half of intense fire like this, pressing down on the rest of the building until it finally was able to give way. It was a very well-built building, probably better, given its size and the attention and everything else, much better than similar buildings built today because it was the first of its style. And as we know, in many American cities as well as overseas, there are a lot more daring architectural structures of this magnitude in many parts of the world today. And in Asia particularly, people building these astonishingly high buildings as showplaces, almost a competition going on in the rest of the world as to who can build the tallest, most daring building. Well, there's a very simple, long box structure built well, according to the engineers who know it. And the heat of that fire from those penetrations of the two aircraft, in his view, may have made the difference. It will take us time to find out. John Miller, latest.
There's really no change other than rescue operations have started now at the World Trade Center, ones that were hampered because of the impending collapse of 7 World Trade Center, the third building to go down. bodies have started to be brought to the morgue, but only in very small numbers now. That's going to be a massive operation that continues. And of course, as we've all discussed, the mounting of a massive federal investigation in tandem with the intelligence community's assistance to the military to try to put a name to this.
I wonder if anybody else is as aware as I am at the moment. I'm sure people are aware as I am at the moment of previous investigations we have done of far lesser incidents. Attack on TWA 800 is one. The investigation at the Al-Khobar Towers, which was conducted by retired General Wayne Downing, who's with us in our Washington Bureau. We'll talk to him after the president tonight. All of these investigations have gone on and on and on and on, and many of them just really didn't resolve anything in the final analysis.
Yet many of them did. The largest acts of terrorism on U.S. soil, ironically the bombing of the World Trade Center, the attacks in East Africa have been solved to the extent that people have been charged, many have been brought back to this country. The FBI actually has a terrific track record that way in chasing these leads out to the ends of the earth. We were talking about something a minute ago, though, that is part of the fog of war in these things. After the Al-Khobar explosion, there were intercepts of people calling Osama bin Laden's headquarters to congratulate him. And in these intercepts, there was no, he didn't say, well, thanks, but it wasn't me. Now the government is taking the position that it was the Iranians. So you really have to sort through the information very carefully before you choose your suspects.
Yeah, I just simply wish to make the point that it's going to take a long time, and that the impatience that we all feel about striking back at somebody who's done this thing to the country is not going to be requited, I think, for very long. ABC's Pierre Thomas, by the way, reports that his FBI sources are telling him that several people on board two of the planes which went down, this would be the one of the Pentagon, at least one of those coming either to New York or to Pennsylvania, were able to get out on their cell phones and call their relatives. And they described horrific scenes on board the aircraft, people being attacked and stabbed on board the aircraft itself. We've heard at least one piece of information that the weapon of choice, at least on one of the aircraft, was a box cutter, what professionals and sometimes amateur use with the razor blade through it, that enables you to open up cardboard boxes in a hurry, and has, of course, been a weapon of crime with which we're all familiar. And as John Miller, who knows more about these things than most, pointed out easier, you take a plastic one on board and it's very hard for a security device to detect. But I want to go quickly to Midtown New York City again, just before we go to the president, and get a quick update from Diane Sawyer. Diane?
Peter, I'm standing out here, and as you can see around me, there's a dramatic change in activity, and I don't know how much you could hear earlier when we were telling you about it, but we have 6 bulldozers down here now. We have an entire line, an entire street full of EMS crews and ambulances. It appears they have got the lights up. The generators are working, and it's very possible they could be moving in soon for some kind of activity actually on the site. And I've got Don Daler here with me. We've been dividing up all the duties here, and he's been down to the scene. And also J.D. Halpern, who said he's just a volunteer who came in from California and was around the area. I just wanted to know, how much fire is there? You said you were just at ground zero. How much fire is left?
Well, the building 7, there was no fire there whatsoever, but there was one truck putting water on the building, but it's collapsed completely. And then the other building that there were some flames still coming up was in World Trade Center 1, but not a lot.
And you said you saw melted tour buses, melted cars?
The cars that were right down there, it was just unbelievable. They were twisted and melted into nothing. The debris is just unbelievable. And then you can see fire trucks and police vehicles that were down there early that all their windows, the windshields are completely blown out must have been from when debris dropped.
We can even see from here that the smoke seems to have gone down, Don. And I want to repeat, Peter, because J.D. was saying, as well as Don earlier, in case you didn't hear us, that it is carpeted up there. It is ankle deep in papers.
In some places, papers and debris go up 2 or 3 feet high. You have to wade through in some areas.
And these are financial documents.
Yeah, the ones I looked at, many of them were financial documents, very personal documents that when I saw the first explosion that hit, there was just a snow cascade of paper, and the whole area down there is just coated with it.
Well, Peter.
Washington, the president and
always see in time.
Pat Dawson.
I'm sure we're going to get it at the end of the change.
something almost only a president can drive home.
Excuse me.
Please stand.
Temporarily.
The U.S. government needs to step up their...
Well, that's the problem, and that's the difference.
You're not the...
Want to take the Twin Towers? Your average day.
Invitation I got to Barbara's wedding.
Dedicated their life.
And Scotland is not on hand.
On them will be
all the way.
Journey. His path. Generally hide their dead.
Dicho que el presidente hablaría y se dirigiría.
Lights and
time. It's our job to put
the president
what's going on in the athletic community
to their full capacity.
Let's hear it.
Town, Republican and Democrat alike, the leaders, there they are, and after their statement by their leaders, they broke into this spontaneous rendition of God Bless America. NBC's Tim Russert is standing by with me as well. Tim, this is going to be a great test, not just for the president, but for his entire staff and, of course, for the political leadership on both sides on Capitol Hill. Let's go now, Tim. I'm sorry, we'll get to that later. Here now is the President of the United States in the Oval Office. We expect to hear from him momentarily.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices, secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shattered steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. Today, our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature, and we responded with the best of America, with the daring of our rescue workers, with the caring for strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could. Immediately following the first attack, I implemented our government's emergency response plans. Our military is powerful, and it's prepared. Our emergency teams are working in New York City and Washington, D.C. to help with local rescue efforts. Our first priority is to get help to those who have been injured and to take every precaution to protect our citizens at home and around the world from further attacks. The functions of our government continue without interruption. Federal agencies in Washington, which had to be evacuated today, are reopening for essential personnel tonight and will be open for business tomorrow. Our financial institutions remain strong, and the American economy will be open for business as well. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbored them. I appreciate so very much the members of Congress who have joined me in strongly condemning these attacks. And on behalf of the American people, I thank the many world leaders who have called to offer their condolences and assistance. America and our friends and allies join with all those who want peace and security in the world, and we stand together to win the war against terrorism. Tonight, I ask for your prayers for all those who grieve, for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for all whose sense of safety and security has been threatened. And I pray they will be comforted by a power greater than any of us, spoken through the ages in Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. This is a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world. Thank you, good night, and God bless America.
President George W. Bush, in his second address to the nation, and certainly the most grave speech that he has made in his very young presidency, as he talked tonight about the terrorists attempting to shatter steel in buildings but not being successful in shattering the steel of resolve in this country, saying the bright light of freedom will continue to burn. He was a sorrowful and sober president, but also one filled with resolve, as he said, we will find the people who are responsible for this and bring them to justice. This has been a long and difficult day for the president, and it's just the beginning because there are many complex decisions that remain ahead of him now. NBC's Tim Russert joins me now from the Washington Bureau, where he is our Washington Bureau chief and moderator of Meet the Press. Tim, the president tomorrow will obviously be sending out a lot of directives to his military, to his law enforcement officers, and also to the people who are responsible for this nation's security at airports and in other places.
Tom, the president cast this tonight as a battle between good and evil, using the word evil several times. Law enforcement officials and intelligence officials hope that with the cockpit recorders, airport records, and perhaps even some celebrations or proclamations by those who did this, they can quickly determine just who must be retaliated against. The president also said something very important, Tom. Whoever harbors these terrorists will be dealt with in the same way as those who committed the terrorism. That is a very important signal and message to people all across the world. Tom, there's a steely resolve in Washington, a passionate determination to bring these people to justice, but there's also a sober realization that our way of life will change forever.
All right, NBC's Tim Russert, who's our Washington Bureau chief. Tim, we're going to ask you to stand by there tonight. I want to go to Richard Holbrooke now, who has been one of our most skilled negotiators and veteran diplomats. He was obviously deeply involved in the Dayton Peace Accords. He was the man who made that happen and tried to bring some sense of peace to the Balkans. Around the world, Mr. Holbrooke, there seems to be this dividing line between Islamic fundamentalists and the United States, not just in the Middle East, but of course in the central part of Europe and in the southeast part of Asia as well.
First of all, I think it's very important to make clear that when you say Islamic fundamentalists, you're not talking about all people who follow Islam as a religion, and I know you and I share that, Tom. But I agree with what Tim Russert just said. The most important sentence in the president's fine speech, which we've all just listened to and which I think the world should understand the president has spoken for the entire nation, regardless of party. The most important sentence in the president's speech was the phrase, "We make no distinction between those who committed the act and those who harbor the people who committed it." And it is absolutely critical now that the United States rally an international coalition so that we don't go it alone in seeking out these people. If, as you have been reporting, it comes from Osama bin Laden, and if the Taliban have left him in their country, they must suffer the consequences. And we're going to need the support of our European allies, of the Russians, the Chinese, and of the Arab moderate states like Egypt and Jordan, which all must join us in the effort to eradicate this scourge that is upon us. As Tim Russert said, it's going to be difficult, but it is something that we must do with other countries to isolate the people who did it.
Richard, no one knows better than you that that's a daunting diplomatic assignment. The last time that that happened successfully, we had a highly conspicuous presence in Saddam Hussein, who had moved into Kuwait, and President George Herbert Walker Bush, this president's father, and his very skilled team did manage to put together an extraordinary alliance. Will it be more difficult this time?
It will be more difficult, Tom, for a reason that's quite clear. We know what the act of war was, and it is an act of war, but not only do we not know exactly who did it, although we have our suspicions, but finding them will be much more difficult than driving an overt, highly visible force out of Kuwait. And we must remember that it took George Bush Sr. 7 long months from August 1st, 1990 until the beginning of 1991 before he launched that military attack. The American public and the world is going to want some kind of action earlier than that, but we'll have to know who it must be directed against. Still, the president's critical statement just now that we'll make no distinction between those who did it and those who are harboring the men who did it is, I think, a big first step towards changing the rules of the game so that people like this can no longer hide behind the kind of horrible behavior that the Taliban have shown in this situation.
Richard Holbrooke, our former ambassador to the United Nations, former ambassador to Germany, a leading State Department authority, and the principal architect of the Dayton Peace Accords for Bosnia. Thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Tom.
General Norman Schwarzkopf, of course, knows a good deal about putting together an alliance and striking back hard in the Persian Gulf War. He was the commander of the Allied forces there, but this is a far different situation that we face now, General Schwarzkopf.
No question about it. No question about it. But I, just like everyone else, was delighted to hear that statement about going after those people who harbor these terrorists, too. That applies not only to the people abroad, but people in our own country who do that.
General Schwarzkopf, we have the mightiest military in the world, but we are facing an entirely different kind of enemy now. That's very plain today in the pain and grief that this country is feeling. Are we going to have to realign our military forces?
I don't think we need to realign them, Tom. We have the capability to strike. The question we're going to have difficulty with is finding them. Number one, identifying them, and then number two, finding them and being able to attack them where we find them.
Have you been surprised that despite all the warnings about the vulnerability of this country to terrorism, that both among ordinary people and even in the highest echelons of Congress, people have refused in some sense to take it all very seriously?
Well, you know, we've always had those two great oceans on either side of us to protect us and sort of isolate us from the rest of the world, and they've always been a sort of a sanctuary for us. And with the world getting smaller and smaller due to international transportation and that sort of thing, those are no longer walls that protect us anymore. We need to come to the realization, and you know, terrorism has been alive and well throughout the rest of the world for a very, very long time, and you can point to it in many different places, and it's come to our shores big time now. We need to understand that.
I know that you still have many contacts in the Arab world among the moderate Arab states. Do you think that they will be willing to stand beside the United States now in a conspicuous fashion against this kind of terrorism?
That's going to be very, very tough for them to do. Very, very tough, because, of course, in doing so, the terrorists have always justified their acts against any of the United States facility because of what the United States support of Israel. And quite frankly, for them to stand up now and support the United States 100% is going to put them in a very, very difficult position with vis-a-vis Israel, because most of those states are anti-Israel.
All right, thank you very much, General Norman Schwarzkopf, who's with us tonight as well. Ambassador Richard Holbrooke did make a very appropriate point, because the reaction in this country will be, in many quarters, to lash out at all people of Islamic faith, all practicing Muslims. And there are about 7 million in this country altogether, many of them in the Detroit area, but also throughout the eastern seaboard as well. That would be a grievous error on the part of the United States, because many of these Islamic countries have been the targets of the same kind of terrorism. Egypt particularly, and Saudi Arabia has not been happy with some of the attacks that have been made in that country as well. These are people who operate like loose bands of guerrillas, and they have their own kind of demented and perverted view of what the Islamic faith is all about, and they attempt to gain their revenge against what they describe as their satanic enemies like the United States through these kinds of acts of cowardly terrorism. The Islamic faith is the fastest growing faith in the world, and it's one that cannot be ignored by this country in so many different dimensions. Let's go to NBC's Jim Miklaszewski now, who's at the Pentagon. Jim, we know that American military forces are on worldwide alert of the highest order tonight. Anything else for us?
Well, officials here at the Pentagon also at the highest state of alert, Delta, which is essentially virtually at a war footing, Tom, where American military are supposed to be geared up, weapons locked and loaded, ready for absolutely everything. But it's been a full 11 hours since that American Airlines 757 slammed into the Pentagon, and firefighters are having a very difficult time with the stubborn blaze. As you can see behind me now, what were just a couple of flickers on the roof are actually now full-blown infernos, apparently, flames bursting through the roof, even more so just in the last few minutes as we've been standing here watching, and much further away now than the original fires that we had watched several hours ago. So it appears that the fires here in the Pentagon are not only stubborn, but spreading. At the same time, television crews were permitted in the area just a short time ago, and they recorded a very grisly scene, Tom. What they first saw were some of the dead that had been removed from the rubble, covered in sheets. There's a temporary morgue actually set up in the center courtyard of the Pentagon here. The exact casualty toll still not known, but scores are believed to be dead and still buried underneath the rubble. And there was also some shots of the damage, exterior damage around the building itself. As you can see from the pictures, it's eerily reminiscent, Tom, of the bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma City. The wide gash in the building and the slanted floors that had just collapsed under their own pressure, and it appears that these rescue workers are a long way from not only containing the blaze, but recovering the victims, Tom.
I find that stunning, Jim Miklaszewski, that they've had all day to work on that blaze. It tells you about the very grievous nature of this attack on that building, that they still have flames at this hour burning through the military headquarters of the United States.
Well, actually, Tom, you know, some consider the location where this plane went in rather fortunate, because exactly where the plane went in was an area that had recently been redeveloped and redesigned with very heavy blast walls and firewalls in that new area there. Of course, can't withstand the kind of impact of a 757. So as you look at the building, the fire did not spread very much to the right, the new portion of the building, and the old portion where the fire continues to spread, much of that had already been vacated. Those offices vacated in preparations of the remodeling effort that was to be undertaken in that section of the building. Even though the death toll here is likely to still rise significantly, the number of dead is probably considerably less than it would have been if this part of the Pentagon had been up to full staff. Tom?
And Jim, a lot of people are going to be looking at all that destruction and wonder whether our military capability is in any way compromised by the damage to the building here.
Well, fortunately, too, this is exactly the opposite side of all the critical command centers in the Pentagon. The Secretary of Defense's office, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs office, the National Military Command, the tank, you've been there, Tom, where some of the most critical military decisions are made. Fortunately, they were all on the other side of the building, and Secretary Rumsfeld never left the building today. After surveying some of the damage, actually helping some of the injured out on stretchers, he returned, not to his office, but the National Military Command Center to coordinate any kind of military assessments and operations that may be underway. Tom, one indication that some plans are already being considered. 2 aircraft carriers were recently in the Persian Gulf, the Enterprise, the Carl Vinson. The Enterprise had left the Persian Gulf, was scheduled to leave the area, head home, and the Navy has told, the Pentagon has told the Enterprise, stay right where you are.
Jim, we do know that the Air Force One had a fighter plane escort when it returned today from the Omaha to Washington leg. Do you think that that might be routine for the foreseeable future?
I would guess that probably will be routine. I mean, we saw the extraordinary scene over here earlier today of American fighter jets, F-16, flying low-level cover over the Capitol and the Pentagon. And I think there will be extraordinary security measures, not only implemented around this building, and they have been stiffened just recently, Tom. All the outside windows have been equipped with Kevlar coating to guard against blast. This portion of the building that have been remodeled, heavy blast walls put in. So they were in the process of trying to make this building terror-proof. It was proven today that that may never be possible.
All right, thank you very much, NBC's Jim Miklashevsky, who is at the Pentagon tonight. Now let's go to NBC's Andrea Mitchell, who covers the diplomatic front and national security matters for us as well. Colin Powell, is he back in the nation's capital tonight, Andrea?
Yes, he is back. He had cut short his trip to South America, flew directly from Lima, Peru, back to Washington, and is now at the State Department. He went to meetings with his top team. They were waiting there on the 7th floor of the State Department for him. So he came back without going to Bogota, Colombia. But intelligence officials and others are all, as you know, mobilizing to try to find the culprits. U.S. officials have briefed some members of Congress. What we're learning now from Senator Orrin Hatch, who's a key member of the Judiciary Committee, is that they did have intelligence intercepts. So after the attack, they did pick up some intercepts, and you know the sophistication of the National Security Agency and their ability to intercept communications worldwide, and they zero in, they target bin Laden's operation routinely. They picked up intercepts with some members of his organization apparently referring to these targets having been hit. They've been successful in the past building cases against bin Laden by picking up this kind of information, these kinds of communications. They also believe that at least one person on one of the 4 doomed flights may have been a member of his organization. So as disastrous as this is, they will have leads from people checking into airports, checking on those flights. They know some of the pseudonyms, the aliases, the fake identifications that are used by some of these people. They've probably got a pretty good head start tonight. George Tenet and his officials are all gathered at the CIA in secure areas and are having meetings as we speak.
Andrea Mitchell, are you picking up anything about sending emissaries around the world in an effort to build what has been described as an extraordinary coalition of people to try to build an alliance against the idea of terrorism? Because it's not just the Western democracies that are being threatened by all of this, but as you well know, many of the moderate Arab states have been targets as well.
And as Dick Holbrooke and General Schwarzkopf were talking to you earlier, it's very clear that we are at a very weak moment diplomatically in the Arab world and in the Gulf region. Our best allies, including Saudi Arabia, top leaders have been blunt in telling President Bush and communicating privately with his father, who is, of course, very popular in that area, and talking to other U.S. officials about how displeased they are about the situation with the U.S., Israel, and the Palestinians. So there is very little support. Bin Laden is a hero, is in many ways an idol to many people on the street in the Palestinian areas. So while we have to be very careful to make those distinctions with Islamic fundamentalists who have nothing at all to do with Osama bin Laden, to radicals in the region, he is a hero. And he will, of course, be made more of a hero if and when the U.S. retaliates. And as both of your other guests were saying earlier, there is no question in anyone's mind the U.S. is going to retaliate not only against bin Laden, because they don't even know exactly where he is, but most assuredly against the Taliban if they can nail down the evidence that he was responsible, because there's no question that the Taliban have been warned. The U.S. is going to retaliate against Afghanistan itself.
NBC's Andrea Mitchell, thank you very much. Let's go to NBC's Robert Hager now, who covers the aviation beat for us. And of course, today we did have the fully unexpected and shocking development of these terrorists hijacking 4 airliners simultaneously, 2 American Airlines, 2 United Airlines jetliners bound for California from Boston, Newark, and Washington Dulles. 2 of them going into the World Trade Center, 1 going into the Pentagon, and another crash landing and killing everyone on board outside of Pittsburgh. This was a well-planned, very cold-blooded, extremely well-executed terrorist attack, Robert, and we have been talking tonight about whether we'll have a resumption of air flight in this country anytime tomorrow. This is one more of the exceptional developments. No airplanes were flying after about noon today.
They were talking about resuming flights at noon tomorrow. They say at least that they'll reassess it at that point. And meantime, there's also some new information now that maybe the weapon of choice here seems to have been knives. We know now that there were knives involved on at least 3 of the 4 aircraft that were hijacked and brought down, and there's been no mention yet of anything about guns being used. But first, let's look at the facts of these crashes today. The string of events that results in these 4 horrific crashes begins at Boston's Logan Airport, 7:45 a.m. American Flight 11, 767, with 92 on board. Supposed to fly Boston to Los Angeles, but over New York State, it's diverted, forced to fly south, directly into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. A long day of carnage is underway. Back in Boston, United Flight 175, another 767, with 65 aboard, is already in the air, also bound for Los Angeles, 15 minutes behind the first flight, when it too is hijacked. This, the actual plane, as it hits the South Tower of the World Trade Center. 8:10 a.m., American Flight 77, a 757 with 64 aboard, has taken off from Washington's Dulles Airport, also bound for Los Angeles. It too, taken over and loops back into the Pentagon. It slices in at an angle, leaving a deadly and ugly gash in the nation's military nerve center. And finally, 8 a.m. out of Newark Airport, United's Flight 93, a 757 with 45 aboard, bound Newark to San Francisco, hijacked as well, but crashes short of whatever its intended target is, comes down in rural western Pennsylvania. Eyewitnesses there.
And I heard a loud noise, and I happened to look up, and it was a plane. It was real low to me. It sounded like it was running fine to me. I just kept watching. I watched it go nosedive straight into the ground.
You could see where the plane made the initial impact in the ground, and it was still on fire. It made a crater probably 30 feet by 30 feet, and it's probably 15 or 20 feet deep, and there's just debris scattered within probably a half-a-mile radius.
There are only 2 ways terrorists can sneak themselves their weapons aboard planes, either through passenger screening or by going unscreened through locked doors into off-limits areas or onto the tarmac. Periodic FAA tests have found plenty of flaws. Found when government agents tried to sneak into secure areas, they were successful more than 2/3 of the time. Found testers also often able to sneak fake guns and explosives by X-ray screening. Once aboard, many speculate the must have disabled crews and taken over. More likely that than forcing a pilot